Why are you here? Are we gonna live life in fear, or are we gonna stand up and make sure we're heard? Are we gonna hide or live life by our word? With integrity we can be all that we can see in our mind's eye until we're finally free. We can become whatever we choose once we know the choice lies within me and you. Now's the time to wake up. No time for playing small. With a painful history and an uncertain future, now is the time to evolve. Hello, all you unapologetically human pleasure monkeys out there. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Unapologetically Human podcast with Dan Boyven, as always. Today, I have for you another interview that I actually recorded back in August of 2018. And this one is with a good friend of mine, Dr. Sofia Raitsin, who happens to be a neuroscientist. So she's a brilliant woman that I love having chats with. And I'm excited to share this conversation with you. There's just a few things I want to explain first. Part of the reason that I was hesitant, a small part, there's a lot of other shit going on, but part of the reason I was hesitant to edit this episode is that Sophia and I are both very analytical people, and when we normally would just have conversations, we'd have like these super long conversations that'd be awesome, the type of conversation that made me want to start a podcast and be like, fuck, I gotta like get these recorded, like people would, I think, really like to hear these. And in like a normal conversation, it'd just be like flowing. But this is actually the second time that we sat down to record a podcast episode, because the first time I was like totally just unprepared, and as many of you may have experienced, whenever you try to like record something or put something out there, it becomes more challenging than, you know, like when you have like a camera in front of your face, all of a sudden you're like kind of freeze up. And so the first time that we recorded, that happened a little bit, and it totally didn't flow. And it just was like, we recorded for like an hour and a half, and we're just like, yeah, this just like is not working. Like we can't use this. We'll have to try again. But this one was pretty good. And part of the reason that I want to share that with you, and that Sophia and I actually talk a little bit about it in this episode as well, is that I think it's really important for us to have examples of media and whatever it might be that people are creating out there that I want to really help to shift with this podcast, is to just show some of the messiness and show some of the mistakes and talk about it, and, you know, help to remove the veneer of perfection that our culture has created for a lot of us. This idea that most of the things we see there's a lot of big budgets behind a lot of stuff that we've seen, and there's just this idea that sort of everything has to be perfect, when obviously it doesn't. And the idea that it does tends to give a lot of us like a paralysis from creating anything, because it really feeds into the feelings that we have that the thing we're wanting to do or the thing that we create isn't good enough, and really this deeply seated feelings within ourselves that we're actually not good enough. So I say, fuck that shit. Get messy, make mistakes, be unapologetically human, and be brave enough to suck at something when you're starting out. Like me, I literally just fucking recorded this whole intro without switching my computer to my professional microphone. So it recorded it from like the shitty little microphone on the side of my computer. So when I played it back, I was like, oh, why is it so quiet? What the fuck? But anyway, this episode was, like I thought it would be, a little bit challenging for me to put together and to edit, because we actually recorded about 3.5 hours, and I was like, fuck, that's a lot I'm gonna have to like go through. And we had sort of quite a number of side conversations about what we were talking about or we're going to talk about, or we lost our train of thought a couple times, and we're like, how are we gonna connect what we just started talking about from like where we came? And I think I did a pretty good job, and I think it's a great conversation that you'll enjoy. So on that note, here we go. Hey, what's up, guys? You're listening to Unapologetically Human, and I'm your host, Dan Boyman. For those who don't know me, I came from a family with a history of mental health and addiction issues, and have struggled with depression, anxiety, and self-worth issues my whole life. Over time, I've learned that so many people I know have had similar experiences, and experts are saying that as a society, we're dealing with a mental health epidemic. So my mission with this podcast is to define some of the issues we're facing and their underlying causes and solutions to those issues, as well as who's working on them. And in the process, I hope to help you understand yourself a little bit better, understand others, and the world that we live in a bit better. So on the show today, I have a good friend of mine here named Sofia Raitsin. Sofia is a recent PhD graduate from the Institute of Medical Science and the Collaborative Program in Neuroscience at University of Toronto. Her graduate research focused on the neurochemistry of depression, preceded by a Bachelor of Science at the University of Toronto specializing in psychology and behavioural disorders. She also minored in philosophy, studying topics such as existentialism, theories of mind, metaphysics of science, and Buddhist philosophy. So she brings a diverse academic perspective on psychology and mental health to the table. She also brings her personal experiences as a side dish, having had intermittent periods of withdrawal and depression throughout high school. While Sofia's educational background is mostly scientific, she also has a creative side. Sofia is an aspiring artist with acrylic paints as her preferred medium, and she also plays the piano and is starting to write music. So thanks so much for being on the show today, Sofia.
Thank you for having me.
So just so you know, Sofia and I just had a really large dinner. So if you hear any burps or farts throughout the podcast, don't mind that.
And it's all Dan.
Okay. So, well, like I said, I kind of want to talk about that. This is round 2 of us trying to record this podcast, because we tried to record it last week, and I'm a horrible procrastinator, so I was not prepared enough as well as I should be for the podcast, and it didn't go as well as I was hoping it would. So I kind of want to talk about that a little bit, to just talk about the reasons why, because I've been struggling with procrastination for like a really long time, and I've been thinking, especially recently, about what are the reasons why, because it's like with this show, it's something that I really want to do. I'm really passionate about the reasons why I want to do it, but I can't get myself to stop procrastinating. So I'm sitting around a lot recently, and I'm thinking like, what is the problem? Like, I feel like I'm talking to a brick wall when I'm talking to myself, trying to get myself to do this work. And it's basically because of fear, right? There's some underlying fears of actually sitting down to do the work, because you're creating something. It makes you have to get out of your comfort zone. And that's when the fear of judgment comes in, and there's some anxiety about that, and like putting yourself and your ideas out into the world. So I think that's definitely part of it, but I just kind of want to share the process with people a little bit, to bring them on the inside a little bit. Because normally whenever someone puts something out there, the conventional wisdom and business sense is that you put out your product and you make it look all shiny and perfect, like it's all ready to go. But I think there's some value in seeing the human side of like struggling through your fears and your anxieties and procrastinations and and fears of judgment to create something and put it out there. So, round 2. Fight. So,
They do say 3's a charm, so.
yeah. This episode might cut to round 3 in a moment. So something that I've been really interested in for most of my life is psychology and mental health because of my own family history and my own experiences with these types of things. But in more recent years, also looking at what are the political and social issues that underlie some of the problems that people are dealing with as well. So could you give a little bit of like a background on your schooling and some thoughts that you have about mental health in relation to some of the political and social issues that we're seeing?
So, my schooling on the topic began from the side of psychology, and maybe let's like break it down because that's a lot of questions all in once.
Okay.
Like if I start talking about all of that, I'll be like giving a monologue for like the next.
That's fine.
Like,
you can talk for a while. Like
Okay.
so that's one of the things as far as like actually if I am a good interviewer on that side of things, my job is to ask good enough questions that I do provoke you to talk for a while. And have an interesting conversation as well, right?
Okay. I don't know how much I can speak about the political influence on mental health per se.
Right.
I don't think I have any knowledge in that area. I can speak to like treatment approaches. I can talk about the biopsychosocial model and that's our best scientific understanding and how like
I feel like we can get there.
And I can talk about like social disconnection, but like I just really feel like I cannot speak to like bigger political things or at least I'm not sure of what you're alluding to.
So let me rephrase the question. What if I were to instead say, so can you give us a little bit of a background on your schooling, and do you have any ideas or thoughts on what you think some of the underlying reasons are for what's being called the mental health epidemic that we're seeing right now?
Yes, that I can. So my schooling began from the psychological perspective. I did my bachelor's in psychology. It was a science, not an arts program, so it was still related to neuroscience. But the psychology courses focused on things like cognitive psychology, social psychology. So the approach was very much understanding it at like the level of those kind of concepts, not neurochemistry, like altered brain structures, although I covered neuroscience in my neuroscience course, but like those weren't specifically related to psychology. It was just kind of more understanding the brain and how it works. And then I was also minoring in philosophy, and I had one of the subjects that interested me the most was existential philosophy. I just had a deep personal interest in it. I guess it started in high school, and I was dealing with some of my own issues with depression, withdrawal, and that was kind of like the philosophy of the meaning of life. And some may think it's the philosophy of despair, but I see it as this philosophy of how to take control and create your own meaning in life. And I also took Buddhist philosophy, which I'm increasingly understanding just how incredibly useful it is as a philosophy. Not necessarily like it's also practiced as a religion, and I just like some of the kind of philosophical ideas behind it, not like follow any specific doctrine. But then I was in a co-op program, and I did my work terms in a research lab that was studying the neurochemistry of depression. So that was very much at the neurochemical level. We were doing brain imaging of a very specific enzyme in the brain that's been implicated in depression, and there's antidepressants that act on it. So I kind of got immersed in that whole biological perspective of mental illness, and I ended up continuing to do a PhD in that same lab where I was studying the neurochemistry of depression. I did some rat studies, and then I did a clinical trial in patients with depression. But the clinical trial was still neurochemically oriented. We were measuring an enzyme in the brain as our outcome measure, not necessarily concerned as much. Well, we were concerned with symptoms and wanted to see improvement, but the study at its core was still neurochemical.
What were you guys searching for? Like, what was the outcome?
So there's an enzyme called monoamine oxidase, and my supervisor discovered now over a decade ago that the levels of the enzyme are elevated in the brain in depression by anywhere from like 25 to 40% on average. Not every depressed person has the elevation, but a substantial portion. And this is the enzyme that breaks down serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, which are the brain chemicals involved in mood and that make us happy. And for decades, it's been theorized that there's a deficiency of those brain chemicals in depression, but there has never been a mechanism found or proposed that could account for why they would be low.
Yeah.
And so the enzyme being elevated, that's the enzyme that breaks them down, that's a very good explanation, because if there's more of the enzyme, it's breaking down more of those brain chemicals. And even before this discovery, one of the more effective antidepressants that's been around for decades is actually an inhibitor of that enzyme. So we knew from a clinical perspective that targeting that enzyme was useful for treating depression. It was theorized that the chemicals the enzyme breaks down are involved in depression, and then this was kind of like the missing piece. We basically, so I did my PhD at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, which is affiliated with the University of Toronto, and they've developed a brain imaging technique to measure specifically just that enzyme, and that's when my supervisor was able to conduct the study and make that discovery. Which is huge and super interesting, how like you can have a new technology and it substantiates what's been theorized for decades and brings together all these other pieces. But towards the end of the PhD, I was kind of thinking back to my days of studying psychology in my undergrad and taking philosophy, and wondering kind of like how it all fits together in terms of how we deal with mental illness and how we treat it. And yes, we are, as you mentioned, in the midst of what's being called a mental health epidemic. And antidepressants are the number one, I think, prescribed psychiatric medication.
Yeah.
And the lifetime prevalence of depression is estimated at anywhere between like 10 to 15%. So 10 to 15% of the people are estimated to have depression at some point in their life, with 4 to 5% of people having depression at any given time point, which is huge. And now antidepressants are prescribed by family doctors. So even without a psychiatric consultation or anything, they're just prescribing, and that's talked a lot. This issue is talked a lot about because there's an opinion that they are being overprescribed.
Right, because that's just from like GPs, like general
Yeah,
practitioners.
they're like, oh, a person is stressed. Oh, let's give you an antidepressant. Oh, you're feeling a little sad? Let's give you an antidepressant. Or you're like a little bit anxious? Let's give you an antidepressant. Let's like not try to understand why the person is sad, what's going on in their life. Send them for some therapy, maybe direct them to other like resources to work on issues in their life. They're just being prescribed antidepressants by their GPs without any specialist consultation. And Yeah, like something like the prescription rate of antidepressants in Ontario has doubled or something like that over a span of 10 years, but depression rates have not doubled. So it just goes to show that the use of antidepressants is disproportionately increasing. And it would have been all fine if antidepressants were actually effective. But the more studies are being conducted, the more and more we're becoming aware of how they're not as effective as initially thought. And even initially, when they were approved for treatment of depression, they helped about 60% of people.
Right. Yeah, I was just going to ask you about that because I've heard on a few different occasions and read about how the idea that the reason for these mental health issues like depression being due to a chemical imbalance, which like the research you said you guys your supervisor came up with or found like something that kind of proved that like there's an enzyme that's breaking down the feel-good chemicals in our brain like serotonin and dopamine, so that's a factor, but it's actually never been something that's been confirmed by any consensus of any scientific body that it's an actual chemical imbalance in the brain that is at the heart of the issue. And isn't that because the treatments work for only some people, because they don't like the antipsychotic and antidepressant drugs and stuff like that, because they don't work for so many people as well, that's not necessarily the main cause of it or the main issue?
So I think there's a bit of a like chicken and egg question in terms of a neurochemical imbalance. I mean, if you think that ultimately psychology is mediated by the brain, then you would expect that any change, anything, any behavior, anything has some underlying neural, scientific, neurochemical, neuroanatomical, neurobiological underpinnings to it. I guess neurobiological is the broadest term that encompasses it all in the word I was looking for. So yeah, so if you like think that all of psychology, personality, our behavior has neurobiological underpinnings, then of course, if the person's mood is different, then there's going to be something different in their brain mediating that. But there's a difference like between saying there's a chemical change underlying the observed change in a person's mood versus saying that the chemical change came first and is the core cause, or like why is there a chemical change?
Right.
Is there a chemical change because there's a faulty gene producing too much of the enzyme that's breaking down too much of the chemicals? Because that would be a purely biological explanation, would imply that there's like some physiological process gone wrong in the brain that's like unrelated to things like the person's social context.
Yeah.
The manifestation is a psychological symptom. Just like you can have like...
So it's environmental as well as biological, and it's like which is
but yes, and the
underlying
environmental it could also be like different kinds of things. Environmental, like was it exposure to some chemical in the water that like adversely impacted the brain, like, or was the person eating too much iron, and too much iron is toxic to the brain and it adversely impacted the biology of the brain, and one of the symptoms of that is low mood? Or is there other factors like stress? Because and actually I might add, there is no difference in the gene encoding that enzyme between people who are depressed and people who are not depressed. So the elevation in that enzyme is not genetic.
right.
It's not genetically
Right,
caused.
and that's what I meant by environmental, not necessarily like coming into contact with a chemical in the environment or like eating something that has a compound in it that changes the brain. I also meant kind of like
yes.
your social setting and things that cause you stress and things like that.
Yes,
right?
and I guess I would further differentiate between the environmental causes, because how you're going to treat it is like You like say it was too much iron versus stress, the appropriate treatment would be different. So they're both environmental causes, but one is a chemical cause, and so like it's appropriate to fix that chemical imbalance that's arising due to like this external environmental chemical that you're putting into your body, versus if it's your social environment or stress at work or like something like that, then the more appropriate treatment might be to teach you coping mechanisms, help you grow and learn how to deal with that environment, motivate you to make change to your life, rather than give you an antidepressant that covers up not the thing that's not the underlying cause, but just the manifestation.
Word.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to segue this exactly, but
Yeah, I feel like I was talking. I feel like I was trying to make a point, and I don't know if that was the point I was going towards or not. But
well, you were talking about.
That's why I kind of.
This is why it's hard to not go on a tangent
when we're
and
just
to like
talking, then it doesn't matter. But like if you ask me a question and it's for a purpose of a podcast, I gotta make sure I actually like, and I'm
or at least try. But, I mean,
like
whatever.
Because like if a person is like listening, they're like, oh yeah, I want the answer, and then the conversation meanders,
and then you don't
and
answer.
Then they're
like, what the fuck?
Yeah, I was like, I want the answer.
Well, I mean, I can always rewind it and listen, but it doesn't really matter that much. And like realistically,
we're gonna get through.
It's like how it's like and
I feel like
and it's like with me launching the podcast, it's like how many people are gonna listen to like this
the first few episodes?
I mean, they'll be up for a long time, like
but realistically,
forever.
most people will not go back like too far, like so it's fine.
No,
it doesn't have to be perfect.
Not likely.
It's more important to get it done and get it out there than to try to make it perfect.
And I'm certainly a bit better prepared this time, and it's flowing better than last time. So yeah, like no, we're definitely on the right track. So we'll try to see if something clicks in your head to remember what we were just talking about. Like we're talking about kind of like you were talking about that there is a mental health epidemic going on right now, and then you were talking about your professor's research.
And I started talking about the overprescription of
antidepressants, and then the difference between how you would treat them.
And I was talking about the actual efficacy of depressive treat. Okay, that's the important point that I wanted to come back to, was how effective antidepressants actually are and what it says about like how we should approach treating. Yes, I think I'm yes, okay, so the last thing I said here was like
we're just talking about the approach will be different depending on
so if you are thinking about like sure there is neurochemical changes in the brain, but it could be seen in a very trivial way as just like, of course there's a change in the brain if the person is behaving differently because something is mediating that change. But that doesn't mean that that's necessarily the way to fix it. And that goes back to what I alluded to earlier, that antidepressants are actually not that efficacious. Even when the first trials were being conducted, the effectiveness of them, it helped 60% of people. Which is like good. It helps a lot of people. Compared to 30% of people that recovered from placebo. So really, antidepressants helped only another 30% on top of the placebo effect.
Yeah, and can you explain what the placebo effect is?
So placebo effect is when you think something is working, you can have a benefit. Even if you're not getting any actual treatment. So in the clinical trials, they would give like half the people would receive a placebo pill, which was just like a sugar pill, and half of the people would receive the real medicine, and a person wouldn't know which one they got. Yeah. So the people who got the placebo pill, 30% of those people had and responded to treatment, which response to treatment is not even like full recovery. They had like categories.
But
it's good.
Yeah,
they had at least I think they defined it as at least a 50% improvement in symptoms, which I'm sure to anyone struggling from depression, they'll happily take that too.
Yeah, which is fascinating because we still don't, doctors still don't understand, or scientists still don't understand the real mechanisms underlying how the placebo effect actually works.
Yeah.
And so there's this whole aspect of like just us believing that we're getting the drug even though we're getting a sugar pill, and they've done it with so many other types of treatments, and that's how like studies are done, is you have like these double-blind
because
studies.
It's so powerful.
Yeah, because the placebo effect is so powerful that it's it's just like our beliefs about whether we're actually being treated or not make our bodies more able to actually heal themselves, and it's mind-boggling that's even a thing. I've actually heard of an explanation to kind of, because they don't really understand why the actual antidepressant and antipsychotic drugs work for some people and don't work for others, because it's like the chemical is just like flooding the brain, right? Like it's not going to any sort of particular area of the brain. And I've heard it like an analogy being like if you had a car that needed an oil change, and basically instead of going and taking the old oil out and putting new oil in and changing the oil filter like you do for an oil change, it's like a very targeted area you need to go do something. The way that antidepressants sort of work is like almost like if you just opened the hood and dumped oil all over the engine and hope some of it went in somewhere it was supposed to. And that's almost kind of like how antidepressants right now work, sort of, because it's like you're just flooding the brain with these chemicals that it's helping people, so they're very useful, and we need them for people to be able to get treatment and get help. But that it's just like this crude kind of way of doing things right now. But there's a lot of maybe some of the stuff that's being done. I don't personally to speak to it right now, but there's a lot of research being done on like much more targeted drug treatments and stuff like that. Is that correct?
Well, I don't know about drug treatments because they were limited to systemic administration, which goes everywhere, but there is like deep brain stimulation where like they implant an electrode, and that's a lot more targeted because then they put it in a very specific brain region. And something like transcranial magnetic stimulation, which they don't implant anything, but they use a magnet like placed over the surface of the skull. And that's also a lot more targeted in which brain regions they stimulate. Although the results of those studies are not as earth-shattering as had been hoped initially.
Yeah. I don't quite recall what it was that I read about some of these more targeted drug approaches. But
I'm not familiar with that. Like maybe they came up with something, but
I'll try to look it up, and if I find some, I'm usually pretty good at finding something if it's like something that I read about before. So I'll try to look it up, and I'll put something in the show notes if I find something about it.
Yeah, that would be interesting because I don't know about that.
But yeah, so you're talking about just like the overall efficacy.
Yes. So basically what the initial clinical trial shows, like 30% of people respond to placebo, which is incredible. And depression has one of the highest placebo response rates compared to like anything in medicine, actually.
Yeah, like the placebo for depression works better than the placebo for cancer.
Which like goes to show just like how much of like at least depression can be modulated through other means that are not medication.
Yeah.
And those are people who are not even receiving any alternative treatment. Like they're not like
it's not in combination with psychotherapy.
No, they come up for follow-up appointments, but they're just like symptom checkups. They're not doing therapy with people. And so them just thinking that, and they know that they could even be receiving a sugar pill. So it's like quite incredible. But the the group that was receiving the actual antidepressant, 60% recovered, but we know that like 30% of that is placebo. So really, antidepressants are helping only another 30%. So actually, the magnitude of effect of antidepressants is just as strong as placebo.
Right.
Because placebo helps 30% of people, and then antidepressants helps 30% of people. But another 30%, an additional 30%. Yeah. But in terms of its strength, it's like 30% and 30%. That was the initial studies. But more recent studies are showing that like even less people actually are responding to antidepressant treatment, like 50%. And that's including those set portion of the placebo effect. And somewhat also seems that the placebo effect is increasing in size in clinical trials in general. It's that's quite an interesting area all of its own. But then there's the added problem that there's a really large recurrence rate even during antidepressant maintenance treatment. So you have these 60% of people, including the placebo, but whatever, let's say just 60 people, they've responded to antidepressants. Say they continue taking antidepressants as maintenance treatment to help prevent recurrence. Over a 2-year period, 50% of those people will have depression again, while still taking the antidepressant.
And probably even at some point in that 2 years, probably upping the amount or is that not part of that
you wouldn't
type
up
of study?
It unless your like symptoms wouldn't. You would up
not
it
for study purposes, but in any normal circumstance.
Well, in normal circumstance, you wouldn't up your dose if your symptoms weren't getting worse. If anything, you'd reduce your dose.
Right, but you were just talking about
I'm saying that
the depression
comes back, and then you
it comes back.
Yeah, so but it comes back not after the dose has been upped. It comes back, and then you up the dose.
I don't know where the confusion came there.
Yeah,
I was on the same page as you.
Yeah. No, the way you said it, it made it sound like they're upping their dose during maintenance treatment, and even in spite of upping the dose,
I think it was
a recurrence.
Confusing because this is like during a study. So during the study, they would stay on the same dose, and then after a 2-year period,
this is this is based also. I think it might also be based on just general also community follow up, not even
not necessarily directly part of the study.
Yeah, not directly like people are just following up people who they've recovered and they've continued their antidepressants to see how many of those people have a recurrence. Because now you're not trying to establish efficacy of medication, so placebo effect is not the issue. You're trying to see how many people relapse even while still taking the medication.
Yeah.
And so 50% of people have a recurrence. So that really, from the initial 60% of people that responded, you're now I've lost half the people. They've now relapsed.
Yeah, and then what do you do?
Yeah, so you up the dose, you try another antidepressant, you try a combination, you go to a second line of antidepressant treatments, then a third line of antidepressant treatments. There's a hierarchy of them and the order in which they're prescribed. But this goes to show that taking an approach of trying to treat a chemical imbalance is really not effective. It's not terribly effective to begin with, and it certainly doesn't fix any core issues, because if it had fixed a core issue, the person would not have recurrence.
Yeah.
If a person has recurrences while still taking the treatment, it means that it's only covering up for symptoms. It's like putting on a bandaid, but it's not fixing anything.
Yeah, the underlying causes of it have still not been addressed.
Yes. So, in a way, the only place where antidepressants are really useful are for people with severe depression. But people with mild to moderate depression, studies have shown that antidepressants actually fail to separate from placebo. So if you separate the people by depression severity, and in the clinical trials, and you compare the efficacy of the antidepressant, but like depending on how severe, then for mild and moderate depression, you basically don't have a difference between the placebo group and the antidepressant.
Right. Right. Like it only really is helping the people that are severely depressed.
So people,
and then there's still, and like, what's the percentage of that is actually helping though? Because there's still a significant percent of the people that it doesn't help at all are the people who are significantly depressed or severely depressed as well, right?
Yes. But at the very least, it's true. But most people fall into the mild to moderate depressed category. And what the studies show is that for mild to moderate depression, there's really no reason to ever give an antidepressant. Yeah. Because it's at placebo level. It's like, why would you give it ever in the first place if
when you could have a sugar pill that does the same
thing? Yeah, like clinical trials are showing like maybe like the upper end of the moderate range, but like definitely the mild to like mid-moderate. There's zero reason to prescribe an antidepressant because it's been shown in clinical trials to perform no better than placebo. So why are you making people take a pill? And it's not like it's like, oh, it's harmless, and if it's giving them a placebo effect, why not? Because it's associated with unwanted side effects. Like serotonin, which is like the main chemical that these medications act on, it's one of the more ancient and neurotransmitter systems. It has something like 15, 16 receptors. They're like keep discovering new receptor subtypes still to this day. It's one of the most complicated systems. Nature has been working in a recycling fashion and a repurposing. And as a chemical evolved and a receptor evolved, and then like a little change evolved, and now it's like serving a different function, and the same chemical is acting on a different receptor in a different part of the brain, but it's like mediating a whole bunch of other effects that are unrelated. And so like
right.
And one of the
so that's where the side effects typically come from because it's acting on so many different
other things,
areas of the brain and different receptors.
Yes, of the same chemical. So when one of the most common and unwanted like side effects is actually sexual dysfunction, and as you can imagine, that in itself causes depression. So
that certainly wouldn't help.
Yeah, so you have like a person who's depressed, you give them an antidepressant to fix their depression, which is giving them sexual dysfunction,
which gives them depression again for a different reason.
And they probably didn't need that antidepressant to begin with, because if they're mild to moderately depressed, the antidepressants don't do anything beyond the placebo effect. And that's not to take away from the usefulness of antidepressants for certain people and from the life-saving effects that it can have for those, because the severely depressed people are the ones that are suicidal, and they're the ones that actually do benefit from antidepressants, and not to take away from that. But, you should not just because it's useful for some people with depression doesn't mean you should just prescribe it left, right, and center to anyone that complains of like a couple of mild depressive symptoms and they came into their family doctor. Yeah, and I've experienced that myself when I've been going through difficult times in my life, because I've gone to therapy a lot of times, and I've had a I don't know if she was just like a counselor, like a social worker, or if she was like a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but the first woman I ever went and spoke to in therapy when I was 17, she put me on antidepressants, but because I was pretty severely depressed at that point, but I only took them for 2 weeks, and I know it takes about a month for them to get into your system and for you to actually feel any of the effects of them, but I pretty sure I already knew about the placebo effect a little bit back then already, and I didn't want to take a pill because of the side effects and things like that. I've always kind of been against taking pharmaceutical drugs because of that reason. But I also knew that like I was smoking a bunch of weed. I wasn't doing, I wasn't working out. I had family issues. Like I knew that there were environmental and behavioral issues behind why I was feeling bad, and that taking a magic pill was not going to help solve any of those problems. So I knew like talking about those issues made me feel better,
but that I didn't really want to take the drugs. And then a few years later, when I kind of was going through a rough time again, I was living up in Barrie for school, and I had a psychiatrist then, kind of the same thing. He gave me the drugs, but I took them for like a week, and then I was like, no, like this isn't what I need. It's not, I've got to make better choices in my life to be healthier and happier and things like that. And I had a doctor at one point. I just went to a walk-in clinic because I didn't have a family doctor, and I told him, like I wasn't feeling very good. I was working out and stuff like that at this point, but just kind of feeling a little blah sort of about life in general, and still family related issues and relationship issues. But he basically told me kind of what you're saying, because it's mild to moderate. He's like, is it affecting your ability to maintain relationships and like a job in your life? I'm like, well, no, not really. Like I had a girlfriend at the time, and I had pretty big group of close friends, and had like a decent job and stuff like that. So he was like, then I'm not going to give you like antidepressants or any medications, because he's like, just make sure you're eating right and spending time with friends, doing things you enjoy doing, watch movies, get out in nature, exercise, like do those things that everyone needs to do to feel happy. Because if you don't do those things, then you're going to, be more likely to struggle in some areas of your life. But unless it's like really affecting certain areas of your life, then don't take antidepressants, because for a lot of people, that's like a life sentence. It's like you start taking them and you basically need to take them forever, which is like that was in my early 20s. And there's been times since then when I've been really dealing with some tough times, and I've flip-flopped for years when I've gone through tough times, thinking like, fuck, like maybe it is because my family history, my mom's side of the family has bipolar. There's a whole bunch of stories about the kind of craziness I've seen with some people on that side of my family, and just how hard they've struggled, that I've wondered maybe it is a chemical imbalance in my brain, or it's genetic, it's hereditary, it's biological. And maybe the reason that I struggle so much is because I should be on antidepressants, but I still never have. Like I've still never gone on them, largely because of like that doctor that said, like you should be doing all of these other things that matter for regulating your mood and having healthy kind of strong coping mechanisms for dealing with, the shit that life throws at you, that everybody deals with. And I knew at any given point when I've been at my lowest kind of points in my life, there's always been like a significant factor of me not doing those things that I need to do, right? And it's because of just stress and work and relationships. You get burnt out and things get you down, and it's hard to make the healthy choices and like go to the gym and eat right, instead of doing the easy things like just hanging out with friends and drinking and smoking weed and eating junk that is not good for you. And they become just like kind of a sequence of unhealthy coping mechanisms for dealing with stress, and they just kind of compound onto each other. And that's been my experience, and I think probably for a large majority of people that are in the mild to moderate category of dealing with things like depression and anxiety, it's very much to do with the choices that they're making in their life, rather than just like, a genetic, hereditary thing causing a chemical imbalance in their brain.
Yes. And even so there is definitely some genetic predisposition, but even for the people that have a family history, it's not like it's a predisposition. It's not like having...
It's not a predetermination.
Yeah, it's not like having the gene for brown eyes, that you're going to have brown eyes, because it's a dominant gene, and even if you have only one copy, you're gonna have brown eyes, guaranteed. And they're like, or if you have two copies of the blue eye gene, you're guaranteed to have blue eyes. Like, this is a predisposition. And the other component is the environment. So even if you have the predisposition, you still have the ability to change the way it's expressed and manifested. And sure, you like may have not chosen the environment you grew up in, but we are lucky enough to live in a society where we have quite a lot of freedom to make active choices to change our circumstances and take charge of our life. And it doesn't even have to be in like a very major way of like quitting your job and necessarily finding another job, or like, which could very well be an important step for some people, but it could even be just changing your attitudes towards things and like taking ownership over your emotions and like deciding what kind of things you were gonna take personally or not gonna take personally. Like, realize that like,
which is easier said than done
easier
for most of us, but it's still possible.
Sure, it's possible. And it's been for me like a journey of a few years of like actively trying to make those changes, inspired by learning about cognitive behavior therapy when I was studying psychology in my undergrad. And I basically started applying it to myself in everyday life. It's basically a method of identifying automatic negative thoughts that influence like and undermine you. So like fear of like success or something, like you think you're not good enough, so you don't try, and like you don't push yourself outside of the comfort zone because you're afraid of the consequences of it. And so it's like identifying those kind of things that hold you back, or like thinking that, oh, that friend doesn't like me because they didn't message me back. But like most of the time people don't message you back just because they're so caught up in the million things that they have going on in their lives, and it's nothing personal. So training yourself rigorously to think differently, and it's a hard process.
It's a skill, though.
It's a skill.
It comes with practice.
Yes, and unfortunately we're not taught that skill. Like, I think it should become part of like our education in like grade school. I think kids should be like taught these coping mechanisms, but as an adult you have a choice. You have a choice to learn those things and to teach yourself those coping mechanisms and to practice them. But it's hard work, and I think that's why a lot of people like antidepressants and psychiatric medication, and I'm going to speak specifically about depression because it's a different story for different disorders, but I would say that anxiety falls under the same category for that matter as depression. That medication becomes a life sentence if you're not actually working to make changes, because then you're just using a bandaid. But if you're not curing the wound underneath, you're just going to need to keep reapplying the bandaid over and over and over again. But it's not a life sentence out of necessity. It's a life sentence because you're not actively working to resolve the other underlying issues that are making you feel depressed in the first place. Mm-hmm. And
it's unfortunate that that's even a controversial statement insofar as it is, because a lot of people who are on antidepressants for like depression and anxiety medication and stuff, we have the cultural and kind of the narrative behind the research that's gone on for the past few generations is that it's a lot more to do with the chemical imbalance, and that people need to kind of stay on it forever. And so many people that I've seen talk about this kind of thing, because some people get defensive and criticize people that say that type of thing, that it's like it has a lot to do with taking responsibility over the areas of your life that are like the underlying reasons for the mental kind of issues that you're dealing with in the first place, because they've got this narrative that it's a chemical imbalance and you need this drug to be able to feel good, and if you don't take it then you're going to relapse and you're going to go back to what you were dealing with before. But there's such little emphasis. I think it's getting better now, but there's been such little emphasis on the fact that all of these other areas of your life are essential to your overall well-being, right?
Yes. So like one concept that I think a lot about that I learned in undergrad is the Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Which most people know about. We kind of all learned about that in
Yeah.
elementary school or middle school.
Yeah.
Maybe high school.
Maybe high. I don't know. I
Not
first heard of it when I was like
elementary
studying it in undergrad. Yeah, I don't know.
Oh,
But,
really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't, and I mean,
I think I meant like public school or just like school when we were younger. I'm pretty sure I first heard about it when I was in high school.
yeah, no, I did not.
Not
hear
like
about
grade 3. Okay,
Yeah,
kids,
kids,
now we're going to talk
Maslow's
about
hierarchy.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yes, and that just speaks to
What?
And the top need of that, like, so obviously the like food, shelter, security, like those are the ones at the bottom of the pyramid, the most important ones where like you can't talk about your other needs if you're starving to death.
Yeah.
Or there's like a lion coming to eat you. Or in modern days, if like you were living in a war-torn zone, your like concern would be over safety before like, oh, self-actualization. I want to become an artist. Like,
Yeah,
but then you're probably also very stressed by your life circumstances. But at the top of the needs, the very top of it is self-actualization. But before that, there is also social connection and love are like some of our important needs. And so if those are not being met, a person will feel depressed, and giving them medication that just artificially makes them feel numb to the pain of feeling socially disconnected or feeling like they're not accomplishing what they want to be accomplishing in life. You're just numbing them so that they feel okay to continue being stuck in the place where they are in life, rather than encouraging them to grow, which is challenging and it's hard and it puts you outside of the comfort zone. And like, I've always had the tendency to kind of like feel more depressed or withdrawn when like something didn't go quite right. But then when I started doing this like personal growth thing and pushing myself to overcome those things so I'm not held back by my own self, that's when I first started feeling anxiety, because it was terrifying. Like, it was scary to put myself out there. But I understood that like if I stop because I'm afraid to feel this feeling of anxiety, I'm just like continue to hold myself back. And the solution isn't to numb myself so that I feel okay with that feeling, because then I'm like not as motivated to grow.
Yeah, and that's one of the main treatments for anxiety from not the drug perspective, but the treatment side of, you know, you go and talk to your therapist, but also they encourage you to expose yourself to the thing that you're afraid of, because it's exposure therapy that the more you expose yourself to something, the less the reaction kind of continues happening, the more you expose yourself to it, because you get used to it and you build new skills and you see that, hey, you did this scary thing that
it's not as
you
bad
went
as
out,
you thought.
yeah, like you went outside your comfort zone, but you didn't fucking die.
Exactly.
Which is what like our brain thinks is going to happen when we're like having like anxiety, especially about like trying new things and, you know, doing it in the face of like fear of judgment and being laughed at and criticized and stuff.
Even if you think about, okay, what if you do get laughed at? What if you embarrass yourself? What is really objectively so terrible about that? Yeah, you feel embarrassed in the moment and it sucks. Okay, but like honestly, people have so much of their own shit to worry about in their everyday life. They're gonna forget about it soon enough. No one is gonna care that you said this like funny thing or like you just like you put yourself out there and it wasn't a huge success. They're gonna move on with their lives. That moment will pass, but you've had a learning experience, and then the next time you can do better. Like, so
yeah, like it. I fully agree, and I get that. It's like, who cares? Like, what's actually going to happen? Like, just deal with it and do the thing and get out of your comfort zone and get better. But I've heard a few different places that I've come across recently that it's like because we don't live in the wild anymore, right? We don't have any natural predators anymore. We very rarely have to deal with worrying about any sort of natural disaster or something like that. And we don't generally have these beliefs about the gods, having wrath on us for whatever reason. So we have this like biological fight or flight mechanism that's been developed over millennia. And it's almost like in our world now, it's sort of useless. Like it's not needed almost like 99% of the time. Like, if you cross a street and a car almost hits you, yeah, it kicks in. But there's not many situations where we're ever actually in danger, but we have this highly sensitive like mechanism in our brain that is there to protect us. So it's like it's just always looking for threats and like what could possibly hurt us. And because there aren't any of these other things that it was developed with, it finds whatever it can. And so now the only thing that we really have to fear is each other, right? Like, so our fight or flight mechanism is just peaking all the time, or it's just, like an undercurrent in our life. And that's why we have all these social anxieties, because the only thing we have to fear now is ourselves and each other. So all of the fears that we have, essentially, it boils down to like things like fear of judgment or criticism or looking stupid or something like that. It boils down actually to the fear of rejection. And the fear of rejection, only like a couple hundred or thousand years ago, because we're such social creatures, if we did something that actually got us rejected by going outside of social norms, then we might actually get rejected and banished from our tribe or our town or whatever, which actually may have led, or likely would have led, to us not being able to take care of ourselves and death. So it's like sure, to us, we recognize that they're just like these sort of silly social fears that we have and social anxieties and things like that. But to our brain, it can't tell the difference, because it's not, that part of our brain is not the conscious part of our brain. It's this much more ancient part. So it's like all of these social fears pushed far enough is about like rejection and about the fear of death, right? So it's like because we're such social creatures and we built these systems of having social norms that we conform to as well, it's actually not just social and cultural, it's actually biologically hardwired into us as well, that if we go outside of social norms, it might lead to us being banished and eventually like dying because of it. So it's like that's what's like actually pushed far enough, that's actually what's underlying those fears. So it's like they're not silly, but at the same time they are, because we're not living in that world anymore. And just like you were talking about, it's still a matter of changing your perspective on these things to see that that's what that fear actually is, but that's not likely
to happen
at all. And so you can still, through practice and through things like exposure therapy, especially if you have anxiety problems, you eventually kind of become accustomed to that thing that you're trying, or with practice you get better and you develop skills and things, so it's a lot easier to deal with. But I just find that to be a fascinating kind of concept. And one of the places that I heard that was there's like an online learning community called Mentorbox that you can they're not sponsoring this, so I'm not getting anything for this, but maybe one day. But it's like
people at Mentorbox, listen.
Yeah, yo, Mentorbox, fucking help me out here, sponsor my podcast. But it's like $7 a month, and it's like a really cool online learning community where a lot of what they do is like they'll interview people, authors of books and stuff, and they'll have the authors kind of give like a half-hour breakdown of all the main concepts in their book, so that you can kind of watch like a half-hour video and get the meat and potatoes sort of like the main things that you can learn from that. And yeah, like one of the founders of it has this video. I can't think of his name right now. It's Jonathan something. but one of the founders has this video and it's all about fear. And there's this really interesting thing that he says at the end of it. I can actually bring it up right now. Yeah, you can open that.
Yeah, I didn't want to like make sounds while you were talking.
No, I know,
That's why
I know.
Stopped. But you got so excited at the sight of chocolate, you were willing to stop mid-sentence for me to open it.
I was just gonna stop talking so that you could open it. It wasn't because I got so excited. Okay. Where is this? I think it's here. So yeah, open that and I'll read this little part. Ooh, white chocolate.
Vanilla flavored white chocolate. I've never tried it before, but I don't what is dark with strawberries?
We're just gonna have a break here to eat some chocolate.
It's Lindt chocolate. Lindt, you want to sponsor our podcast?
Yo, Lindt, help me out.
So we're trying this vanilla bean white chocolate with Madagascar vanilla.
Oh, it's delicious.
And the other one is with dark chocolate with strawberry pieces. So good. You should head to your local store.
Go into any store and give them the code unapologetically human, and they'll give you 20% off any Lindt products. Just kidding. Soon. Because of this conversation, I'm gonna approach Lindt and be like, even though it's not like a food podcast, it has nothing to do with that.
But hey, we'll be like, hey, chocolates help depression.
Oh, there it is. That's the pitch. It's the best chocolate for helping with
elevate
depression.
Your mood. It's about the little pleasures in life to make you enjoy life and feel good. Try Lindt chocolate.
I'll just send them this part of the recording and they'll be on the next episode as sponsors for sure.
And make sure they send us some samples to review.
Oh yeah, for sure. How else are we gonna talk about it if we don't get to eat it for free?
Yeah.
That's so funny. Oh yeah, what is this guy's name? I have it here too. Jonathan Kendall. That's it. Chocolate. So good.
Isn't your mood already better?
It really is, yeah.
I mean, I see that smile.
It's true. It works. And fast.
Yeah. Faster than antidepressants, which takes 6 weeks to kick in.
Yeah. This takes like 6 seconds. Not 6 weeks.
So like on the way to, so I go to this like shop called Fruits on Bloor. That's where I get my produce.
Yeah.
And on the way there, I was like, I stopped by Dollarama and another one. I'm looking for like some more like kitchen tools that can be used for my art.
Is that what those were?
No, those are for actual like, and that's been here for days. I've just been lazy to wash them. But. And I walked into this like one random store, and as I was approaching the counter to pay for like, I got this like spatula thing that I can use for swiping. It's literally like one of those things like I don't know for cakes, like for like little triangular things.
Right.
But and then at the counter, I was like, they had like these Lindt chocolate, they're like special $2 a thing, which was like really good for Lindt. And like all these flavors, and I was like very skeptical. I even checked the expiry dates on all of them because I was like, are they just selling expired chocolate for that cheap?
Yeah.
And they were all good, and I was like, have they been damaged in like transport or something? But anyway, I still got 4 bars because I was just like, I want all these flavors. It's a decent price. I'm happy to see they're actually fine. I hope their special is their permanent price, and that's just their marketing strategy.
Yeah.
Or should I like stolen off a truck?
Stolen Lindt chocolate.
Don't send that to Lind. Don't tip them off. I want my cheap chocolate supply.
Lindt, if you sponsor my podcast, I'll snitch on the people that robbed you.
But only if you guarantee Sofia a lifetime supply of Lind. Or else she's not giving up the source. If she wants her cheap chocolate.
It was Sophia.
I didn't steal it.
You robbed a chocolate truck?
No, but I possibly bought it from someone who did. No, I don't know. I don't know how that, but I had like a whole selection of all these different flavors and stuff. Legit. Certainly marketing done right. I came to buy a spatula and walked away with 4 chocolate bars.
They got you. All right. You want to do this? Mm-hmm. You ready? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, so I was just talking about how there's that idea that, like, push far enough, fear, all the social fears that we have is essentially based in our fear of rejection, which not that long ago would have probably meant certain death. And I find that to be like a fascinating idea. And then we're also talking about just that you have to expose yourself to the things that you're afraid of and things like that. And so one of the founders of Mentor Box, he had this talk all about fear where he ends it off saying that you can eventually start to see fear as kind of like showing you exactly what you need to do. So he says, eventually you'll not only realize but know that fear is obsolete. In fact, you'll learn to love it. You'll see it as a guiding light, and X marks the spot. Because here's the thing. If you want to accomplish anything great in your life, and I know you do, then you're going to have to relentlessly push your boundaries. You'll have to expand your comfort zone out way past where everyone else is comfortable. Which means along the way, you're going to have to face your fears over and over again. Fear, now as a stepping stone, as a series of lily pads. Fear now as your map and as your friend. And then he goes on to say, like, let's get serious. We all kind of owe it to ourselves and our family and our entire collective society to push past and get past our fears, because we need each other. Like, we need everybody right now to step up and each do their own part, because there are these much wider spread, larger issues that are happening out in our society as well that we need to be focused on. And so maybe we can kind of switch gears here a little bit and talk a little bit about that, because even when you were talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like, obviously if you're living in a war-torn country, then like something like antidepressants definitely aren't going to help the underlying causes that you're living in a war-torn country. Like, it's not going to make that stuff go away. And even for over here, it's like one of the main reasons that is probably a large contributor to the mental health epidemic that we're seeing. Like, we're not living in a war-torn country, but we're certainly seeing about that stuff on the news all the time. And we have like these growing political divides, and we have all of these things that are going on. There's environmental destruction and climate change and species extinction. I've heard on a couple occasions and read that the rate of species extinction right now, because of the same kind of things that are driving climate change and ocean acidification and stuff like that, the rate of extinction for plant and animal species right now is 1,000 times faster than what we typically see in the geologic record, which is fucking terrifying. And we know that we're not really doing a whole lot about these like larger issues that are happening, right? It's like there's so many things going on and we're constantly being bombarded with all of this stuff too. So I know for me, a lot of that stuff really affects my mental health because it kind of makes you feel like the world is falling apart and there's nothing we can do except watch. It's like that idea of like watching a train wreck right before it happens. It's like it happens in slow motion or something. So I know you mentioned before, as far as the like very political side of things, there's not a lot that you kind of have to add to that conversation or necessarily want to add to that conversation. But we could have a little bit of a discussion maybe about like what are the underlying reasons for all of these issues. And
it's a kind of
like you don't necessarily,
and I don't know what I would say that
well, you don't need
like
it necessarily
good and useful and of substance, and not me talking out of my ass because I also don't follow these issues. Because
what about the mental health ramifications of dealing with this shit?
I
all
still
the time?
think those are like.
It's just too specific outside.
And I also think that the mental health, like, unless you are the person living in that war-torn country and you're actually dealing with that devastation, like, for the average person living in North America, just reading on the news, like, I don't think that's a cause of mental health problems. I think, if anything, a person might use that to blame their mental health problems on that, but, like, ultimately, what really affects people is their everyday things. And if a person is struggling with mental health problems, I would say that they still have like something very concrete and specific and very personal in their lives. People don't get depressed about impersonal things, really.
Well,
you can be saddened and you can be saddened and worried about it, but there's a difference between like being saddened and worried about a larger issue versus like feeling depressed day to day in your life and feeling anxious. You're not anxious because there's war in Syria. You're anxious because of all the personal things you've talked about. If all those personal things would have been resolved, you would be worried about that. You might feel as a fellow human being a sense of responsibility to try to make a world a better place, but you wouldn't feel personally anxious and depressed in your current life circumstance. That's why I think like that larger context isn't relevant to resolving mental health issues here in Canada for the kind of, and for people there. The conversation isn't about mental health. It should be about how do you resolve a war, conflict, which. Like, do you get what I'm trying
to say? No.
That's why, I don't think...
I fully understand what you're saying, and I agree.
But, like, do people actually think that is the cause of mental health? You think that?
This is part of my experience, but what you're saying as well is actually very kind of correct for my own experience as well, because when it really comes down to it, it's more the fact that we have access to this information so much that it's very hard not to look at. It's the same, you can go back to that slow motion train wreck analogy. It's very hard to look away, right? That's kind of just a very human thing. And because we have, through the internet, we have access to kind of do that over time, which is the way that the mainstream media news works as well. We're just constantly bombarded with bad news because we pay more attention to that. And there's that underlying kind of biological evolutionary reason that we pay attention to negative things more than we pay attention to positive things. And we remember negative things, our negativity bias, more than we remember positive things because if it's something that was a personal experience to us, they cut deeper, they hurt more, we remember them more, and we pay more attention to the things that in theory could potentially negatively affect our life, even if it seems like it's like somewhere down the road, or we just like we pay attention to this like negative stuff because in our brain it's like we're trying to think of how it could affect us and how to protect ourselves from it actually having any sort of negative effect. So something that I did, especially in my early 20s, like when one of the times when I had a bit of a breakdown in my life and difficulty dealing with my stress was I was in school up in Barrie in 2008 when the financial collapse happened. And I was in school for graphic design. I got much more interested in what was happening with the financial collapse because I saw all these news outlets basically screaming Armageddon, like the world was ending, and they were all using the same talking points. And it just like it blew my mind. Like it shook my world so much that it changed the course of my life. And I got so much more interested in like politics and social issues because I was like, what the fuck is going on? Seriously, like, isn't it a whole bunch of people's jobs specifically to make sure that this shit doesn't happen? And, you know, fast forward, it's like nobody got in trouble for it. So like it kind of put me on this journey of looking into what was actually going on in the world. Like, how did we allow people, how did we have systems set up in such a way that people were able to behave in such a way that led to the collapse of the global economy, where a lot of people, like, their lives were ruined from that. They probably, a lot of people killed themselves because of that. I don't know that that's true. I don't have a stat on that or anything, but people's lives were ruined. They lost their houses, they lost their life savings, and a lot of these bankers made, you know, millions, billions of dollars. No one got in trouble for tanking the world economy, basically, right? But I got much more interested in politics and social issues, and I really couldn't focus on school. And there's an addictive quality to that as well, right? Because you get that like physiological response from taking a look at this information all the time and thinking that it's somehow going to give you the knowledge or prepare you for like what might happen with what's going on and things like that. Because it got me into like that's when I got into a lot of conspiracy stuff as well, which is like really kind of addictive. There's a whole egotistical thing to that like
you start feeling special because
you think you're in the know. You're in the know,
yeah.
And everybody else is a stupid asshole. They're sheeple, and you're a warrior for truth, and you're trying to wake everybody up, and all this stuff. And I saw like the subculture of that to a large degree, and I only looked at that information for like a lot for a few months, and it was after like looking at almost nothing but like kind of really negative conspiratorial information about like who's in power in the world and what they're doing and all this type of stuff, like Illuminati type shit. I got like really scared and really kind of depressed because of that. And that's obviously not necessarily because of what's happening in the world. That is more because of like my own actions, like you were saying, of like what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis, not, you know, hanging out with friends and going to the gym and stuff like that, like good healthy things as much as I should, and being out in nature, but just like being on my computer reading about how fucked up the world is all the time, that certainly affects your mental health. And it's not necessarily what's actually happening out in the world, it's what you're doing and the mental headspace that you're in. Or like, well, that was me, like the mental headspace that I was in because of taking in all this negative information.
Yes, which I actually think we're exposed to too much information, especially with smartphones, and it's good to limit that for our mental health.
Oh, for sure.
Like, unless you're gonna make yourself like active in working on a certain issue, I don't see the point of like following too much news. Like, it's good to know the general things that are happening, but like, it's quite pointless to track every development in like some issue because unless you're gonna be involved in doing something about it. Like, what good is it for you to know all those details?
For sure, and I agree. Going back to some of the wider issues, like I kind of got out of that conspiracy culture type stuff right away because I saw the type of people that were in there, and it's like they look like they've been like doing this for years. Some of them older people that like look like they've been like these like truthers for like decades, and it's like
they wear aluminum hats.
Probably some of them. But yeah, like you could see that like they're not actually doing anything for actually trying to help solve any of these issues. And I felt like very viscerally that I was like, whoa, like I feel like shit because I'm taking in all of this type of information and I need to stop it. And it had a lasting imprint on me where for many years I still was kind of in that headspace, not all the time and certainly not as much, but periodically that type of thinking would kind of come back because I read and watched so much conspiracy stuff for like a few months that whatever that time frame of looking at that information wired that knowledge into my brain sort of thing that it would peak up and kind of spike throughout my life since then, sort of. And it's gone down and down and down over the years since I've moved further and further away from that. But I still kind of get that feeling sort of sometimes where, because it's like it gets very attached to your fight or flight mechanism because it's like it's all this information about who's controlling and destroying the world basically. That's a little bit of a tangent, more specifically into the conspiracy stuff than I was meaning to get into, though. But to the point, though, is that it's like, as far as all of the information that we have access to and that we're constantly being bombarded with about all of these like problems in the world, like you were saying, it's a good example that it's like not many people over here, especially like even people that are dealing with depression or anxiety or any sort of mental health issue, are experiencing that because of knowing that, you know, there's a war in Syria or something like that. Because no one really worries about stuff until it actually is going to become an issue that affects you.
Family there,
that affects you
there,
in your life.
Yeah, then it's like
the one thing that I do think does affect us is that like climate change. You know, some people are still arguing against the fact that there's a 97% consensus among scientists who are experts in the fields that study that sort of thing. But climate change is this existential threat to our species. And, you know, we're living in a world where humans have so much control and power over what we're capable of doing to the planet and the planet's environment that like scientists have declared that we're now living in a new geologic era called the Anthropocene. It's like the era of like the human because of how much power that we have. And because if climate change doesn't kill us in the next maybe 100 or 200 years, if we stay on the track that we're on now, which is one of the things that is kind of talked about, then humans in the future will see in the geologic record the effects of our time right now. That's why it's being like called the Anthropocene. But it's like we know that with business and government and how we live our lives generally, we're still kind of doing business as usual, and we're not actually making changes or addressing the issues like climate change nearly as fast as we need to in order to avoid catastrophic consequences because of it, where the level that we're already like almost guaranteed to hit unless we come up with some really, really amazing and rapid technologies or ways to reverse some of the CO2 in the atmosphere and the effects of climate change, that it's like we're gonna for sure see like a rise in global average temperatures above the 2% threshold, which the world governments at like the climate accords and stuff, you know, where they actually came to an agreement at the Paris Climate Accords, that we have to stay below 2 degrees, which doesn't sound like much, but you can look into more info for a bit more of a detailed explanation of what that means that I can't really explain right now. But it's like at 2 degrees, it's an absolute like catastrophe, the extreme weather events that are going to happen and how hot it's going to get. And like the Paris Accords, they like agreed that we have to stay below 1.5 degrees, but it's like it wasn't legally binding, and most of the countries around the world are not doing the things that they kind of said they would or that we need to in order to stay under those limits that we've set. So it's like we're looking at this like existential crisis in our future that's threatening the very survival of our species, and we're not doing anything about it really. So like for me, that type of thing has a lot more bearing and weight to it than say like the war in Syria, because it's like we could potentially, if we don't address that, our species could be extinct in 100 years.
But that's our species in 100 years. You're not going to be alive.
Yeah.
So I would challenge to ask you if you actually think that's yet another issue of concern and worry versus a cause of actual like depression and mental health problem.
I don't think necessarily on its own, because I think like you're saying, like it definitely still is other factors, like again just like taking in too much negative news of that type in general and not doing other healthy behaviors in your life that you need to be doing, like eating right and spending time with friends and family and in nature and getting proper exercise and stuff like that.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking, like, say you did a survey of people who are depressed and you ask them what's making you depressed. I think the at least first 10 reasons would be something personal before they reach like anything
sure.
like more like that. And if all those things are in check, I would say a person wouldn't be depressed about climate change. They might be worried and motivated to become an activist. Well, yeah,
that's like the future. Depression is usually stuff from the past that like you are sad about or you regret. I just think it's like personal,
deeply personal things, probably that have to do with something from the Maslow hierarchy of needs not being met in a very like direct, immediate way, not like, oh, in 100 years our species might be extinct when I'm no longer alive. My children might be affected. That will be like, that would fucking suck. But like, you know, it's not like,
yeah,
that's like if you like, and even like before you got to this topic, even like in your intro, the things that you've listed that are like most distressing to you are all deeply personal issues from like your childhood, from like you not accomplishing the things. Those are the real issues that I think those are the types of issues that make people depressed, I think, and have mental health problems. Those other things I think make people more generally worried.
Yeah.
But if they didn't have any underlying personal kind of like issues, wouldn't that, I don't like, well, I don't think that would be like, I don't think that's an explanation for the mental health crisis. I would look more at our like, I guess I would look more at like our social structure, our like lack of community, for example, like those kinds of like.
So before you get too far into that, that's actually like, I agree with you. I actually agree with everything you're saying. And it is, I'm probably like I
And
said,
I guess,
I'm probably
and that's
not gonna
kind of
put
like
this
why
in
I
there.
didn't want to talk about the political stuff. I guess because, like, as a side
I
note,
think-
like, I actually don't think that's like a major like I'm not saying it doesn't contribute to someone's mental health issues, but I just think it's a very minor thing and doesn't account for the crisis that we're
For sure.
observing.
For sure.
Because by any objective measure, we're still doing like way better socially and globally than ever in history, apart from the looming problem
it's the most
of like
peaceful and prosperous
Yeah,
time
so-
that's ever
so-
existed.
yeah,
Like, there's the
so-
least war right now than there's been
yeah,
in the last
and the least like immediate survival
50
concerns.
years or like all of history basically. So yeah, like I
I don't think
totally
anyone who's
agree
like
with you.
well adjusted is gonna get depressed because they're finding out about climate change. They might get angered, worried, like
Well, a
like
big
a wake
part of
up.
it,
But like I don't think anyone is gonna fall into like this like actual like personal anxiety and depression. Like I don't think
so there's a couple things. Like, I agree with what you're saying, and I actually really like kind of. It doesn't sound like new information to me, but almost like I haven't heard this in a while or something, because I kind of have. That's been one of my stories, sort of, for me, because I actually like really care about this stuff, and I've done all this research into it over the years and stuff like that. But most people haven't, from what I can see, and most people don't really care. They don't really even think about it. So that's obviously not the case, just like you're saying. Like, and if you were to poll a few thousand people, that would be a very, very small percentage of people that would even probably list that
as like their 20th reason.
as a reason at all, let
yeah.
alone one of the top reasons, and specifically probably not the top reason at all. And you're right.
And I would say even
And
for you, as someone who cares, that would probably like
also,
if you're like very like.
Well, no, I wouldn't say that that's the main thing either. And it is everything you're saying, that it's the other reasons, and it's because I've been dealing with these issues. I've been dealing with fucking depression and anxiety my whole life. That started when I was a kid, and there are certain things that have happened in my childhood, adolescence, and my early adulthood that have been like large contributing factors to me dealing with these mental health struggles my whole life. And if it weren't for the fact that I already was dealing with mental health struggles generally, and at times in my life where, like, when I first got into politics and social issues and stuff like that, and I got into this conspiracy culture, that was kind of like, I can't think of the right word. That was kind of like triggered by the fact that I wasn't sure if like being in school for graphic design was what I wanted to do. And then the global financial collapse happened, and I got way more interested in politics and social issues. And then I got into this really negative conspiracy culture type of shit. And that probably wouldn't have happened if I wasn't already dealing with some mental health struggles, and they were amplified by the fact that I just dropped out of college.
Could have also been a distraction and a thing to like misplace like the like attention.
Like, in what way?
Like as a distraction from like the other things that you were struggling with at the time in your life.
Yeah, for sure.
Kind of like how like addiction is usually like it's a coping mechanism.
Yeah,
it's an unhealthy, but it's like it provides like
bad coping mechanism.
Yeah,
for
distraction,
dealing with stress,
and the other way.
It numbs you, and it
Yeah.
it distracts you from having to deal with the real issues that are going on in your life.
Yeah, and gives you like another thing to focus on.
Yeah.
It's like very immersive.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. I'm just trying to think. So
I guess okay. There's like one thing that I wanted like to talk about. So one thing that like I guess kind of like which is like my message, if you will, if I wanted to like have a message from like, I guess, my experience with like my education and my personal experience towards like treatment and overcoming mental illness, which you don't have to include this, but like I guess my message would be like something about like we need to take ownership over our lives and responsibility for our lives. So like one of the underlying causes of depression, not causes, but like one of the learned helplessness is like a major concept in depression. So when people feel like their actions don't lead to consequences and they can't do anything about their situation, that's when they feel depressed. And I think in many ways, like we haven't been taught to effectively deal with our situations. And where we think there's nothing we can do about a situation, really we can. It's just not an easy solution. And it will take a lot of effort, a lot of effort and a lot of discomfort. And like, I also think we in a way don't want to expend effort, and maybe there is like an evolutionary basis to that.
Yeah.
And so it's like it becomes a balance of like, oh, like I'm depressed but comfortable, versus I can overcome my depression but be very uncomfortable in the process. So it's like you're like it's like
It's like this like catch-22.
yeah, so it's like you're on the one hand you are depressed and you don't like it, but you are comfortable.
Yeah, because it's familiar.
It's familiar, and in a way you like the learned helplessness. It's like because it's familiar and comfortable, you almost like I feel like.
We prefer
And this
it.
is gonna be controversial to say, but people prefer to choose to be depressed because it's more like, and blame it on something else and not take ownership over their feelings and not take ownership over the things that they can do personally themselves to. And it doesn't even have to do with like, you don't even have to necessarily make big changes to your life, just to your own attitude and how you process information and retrain your thinking patterns, which is really hard work.
And it's done through small steps.
Over time,
though, right?
yes. And so we don't have enough of that motivation. Certainly, like when a person comes to a doctor and complains of depression, the doctor doesn't say, well, maybe you should focus on personal growth.
Yeah. No, but like it shouldn't even be that controversial, because like that's something that I've read about recently, that like people hang on to their trauma because like they're so attached to their trauma and their depression or whatever, their way of thinking that's leading to their depression and anxiety and stuff like that. Like people get so attached to it, and I can say, like, I agree with what you're saying, because there's been a lot of times in my life when I look back now that I've done a lot of work to make changes in my life, that there was a lot of behaviors of not taking responsibility for my behaviors that were leading to my depression and my anxiety and stuff like that. And people tend to, a lot of times when they're dealing with this type of thing, latch on to like their trauma or their mental illness because they've attached having that so intimately to like their identity and their idea of like who they are and what their normal way of living life is.
And I feel like it becomes an excuse
that it's
that they
it
can
is an
use
excuse
not to do things.
Yeah, because then you play the victim, you don't have to take responsibility, and you can blame everyone else. You can blame your parents, you can blame your siblings, you can blame your third grade teacher for something they did, and you can blame the world for you dealing with what you're dealing with. And because, like you said, because it's familiar, because we as humans, we all know that we fear the unknown, and it, even though we know we hate it, we hate having depression or anxiety or self-worth issues and stuff, we still prefer it because it's familiar than taking the risks and doing the hard work in order to get out of our comfort zone to actually make changes.
Also, when you start taking responsibility, like not every action is gonna lead to an immediate success, but then you no longer have someone else to blame because that was your deliberate action. So like I think that's also a thing that like holds us back and a fear of responsibility. And like, because if you're like gonna like actually take active steps, then you're gonna be responsible. You can't blame your third grade teacher anymore if you're trying to work on personal growth and you took a step and you took a misstep and it didn't lead you quite in the direction you wanted, but like now that's on you. And also, I want to look up a lyric of a song that I think is like just captures this idea very beautifully. And I mean, I would know all about sadness being as part of my self-image in my high school days.
Yeah.
Like where I was like all emo and I embraced it, and it was like almost a competition. Oh, who's sadder? Who's sadder? Who's like that's the more emo person, and you're doing it right.
This is part of what I've been having a bit of a struggle with for like even like the message and the audience for the podcast too, because it's like I'm not necessarily like looking to get people who are like severely depressed and like having a really hard time at shit to be like the listeners of this show. Because I'm not a clinician of any sort. I'm not an expert of any sort. I've dealt with the shit myself, and I've dealt with doing a lot of the work necessary to change my thoughts and my behaviors and stuff like that.
Wait, sorry. I'm just
yeah.
distracted at the moment because I'm trying to type.
No, that's okay.
Hold that thought, because
this doesn't require a response from you.
No, but like I also want to process what you're saying to me, so you're not talking to a brick wall with me.
That's
you
what I do.
That for yourself.
That's what I do.
You have
That's
yourself
what I do for myself, with myself.
Okay, it is. I found the song. It's from Smashing Pumpkins. The song "Zero" by Smashing Pumpkins. It has a line. Intoxicated with the madness, I'm in love with my sadness.
Yeah.
That line, I'm in love with my sadness. Like, people love feeling sorry for themselves.
Yeah.
And that's why, like, they're not motivated to get out of depression. Like,
because
I will say it. Yeah.
It allows them to continue to not take responsibility for their thoughts and their actions and their life.
Yeah,
and
they can blame somebody else.
And
I just really, like, that was just one thing that I wanted to say, because that's, like, where, like, my thoughts are on, like, overcoming mental illness, and I just felt like I wanted to say that message.
No, for sure. Like, I agree with that.
Oh, and I had a point I wanted to say, the note that I made when you were talking about the, like, how, like, from an evolutionary perspective, not evolutionary, but like from our like old social like history, like social rejection was a very important thing, because you can get ostracized and like you could literally die. And I still think social like rejection is still a very important factor to be mindful of. And just because we live in a society where like you won't immediately die, but like you could still like feel very disconnected and not have like, and that's kind of what happened to me in my high school days. I had people that like were friendly with me. I wasn't bullied, but it wasn't people I truly felt connected with. So I did still feel very disconnected, and the people that I felt connected with were back home in Israel. So and definitely like in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, belongingness, social belongingness is like in the middle of the pyramid. It's not even one of the, it's like right above whatever, like food, shelter, and safety. The next thing up is social belongingness. So in like, I guess thinking of like, oh, embarrassing yourself. I mean, I was thinking it in the context of like, oh, like say you're aspiring to become a musician, and like you're having your first show with your band, and like you come and you get choked up and like the words didn't come out. That's embarrassing. But like in that context, like your friends aren't gonna reject you for like choking up on stage. But like you shouldn't go out and be doing like, oh, like now I'm all about like personal growth. I'm gonna tell mean things to my friends because that's just what's on my mind. Like that would be a detrimental kind of way of interacting. Like you shouldn't be and like you should still be a decent human being. So I think if you make a point of being a decent human being, and the risks you take are more about like just the pursuits you wanna kind of do, and if they're like not harming anyone, then in that context, any like negative outcome you might feel isn't like a real like social negative consequence. So, but yeah, I think feeling disconnected socially that's probably one of the leading causes of our mental illness epidemic. And certainly addiction. There's like the whole social dislocation theory of addiction, which says that people become addicted to like, well, it started as a theory of drug addiction, but like could apply to anything when they don't have meaningful social connections that they're satisfied with, then people will connect with something else, like a substance or a video game to provide.
Or yeah, just like an object. You see some people in like those like weird
like fetishism
addiction shows on like TV.
Like to like connect with something to like feel that need for
because it's so important for us.
Because I thought that was like a very important point that you made about the like rejection, and in the past that it could mean like death if you get ostracized, but it's still a very important factor, like not to be actually socially rejected, even if it's not gonna kill you in the sense of like starving to death and not having shelter, but you're still gonna
it's like still gonna like affect
most
you.
People are social. Most people, so like a very small percentage of people.
Well,
like,
even people that aren't, it's like, well, why aren't they? It's probably due to some sort of like being social never got them anywhere. Like maybe they had a shitty family and
yeah, but some people are actually like happy being asocial, and then I would argue why. Like, you know, you have like those people who are like loners. They go off to live in the woods by choice, and they're pursuing their hobby and they're quite satisfied with it. They have like their little workshop. Why force them to move out of it? If
well, no, you wouldn't force them to move out.
If they're happy with like being asocial, then I would say let the person be. But most people are not happy.
Most people aren't. And I think I would think even like a majority probably of people who even, maybe not a majority, but I would think that even a lot of people who are very comfortable being asocial or just being on their own all the time and stuff like that, that's also like a survival coping mechanism that they've had to develop and get comfortable with because that was like the only option. Like even me to a certain extent, like I've always been very, very social, but like I've been off work for the last 5 months. I spend all day, every day at home by myself almost. And I'm not all day, every day. Like I come and hang out with friends. I go out and grab beers with people and stuff like that. And I see people, but I spend like 95% of my time by myself working on things that I'm like working on that I care about. And I'm fine with it.
And that's fine. Like,
but a big part of that is because it's been just like a coping mechanism that I've had to develop, which I think is part of the reason why this is related to my procrastination and stuff, because like I'm going to CAMH for like a tech addiction group right now because I spend so much time online in like my free time over the last 10 years almost. I've spent so much of my free time outside of work and socializing researching all this different stuff that I'm interested in. And even that has been a bit of a coping mechanism for not having really strong social bonds and stuff, right?
Yes. But I think like having strong social bonds and the percentage of time you spend socializing are like kind of like two separate parameters, because you could spend 50% of your time socializing and feel completely empty and dissatisfied. Yeah. Or you can have a couple of very like genuine strong connections, see those people like once a week, but because you're pursuing other things, like, and you're motivated to pursue those other things, it's not a coping mechanism. It's like, it's just that there's like at the top of the pyramid in Maslow's hierarchy is self-actualization, which could require a lot of solitary time. And so it's like, and that's the point. When you feel secure in your social bonds, you're okay to see them only once in a while and like when you want to socialize, and it's fine. Like you can, like, to say that you're by yourself 90% of the time is not necessarily a bad thing. Is not necessarily mean that you've developed a coping mechanism of feeling comfortable with yourself. It really like depends on the context. If the context is that you're spending 90% of your time because had you wanted to socialize, you'd have no one to connect with, or are you spending 90% of the time by yourself because you actually need the time to achieve the other things that you want, and you have those like strong connections that like you don't, like you've already like connected so well that like anytime you can just call up the person and like they're there.
Yeah, like there definitely is an element of it that it's like I'm okay with spending that much time by myself because I'm working on stuff that is geared towards self-actualization, building a career for myself, doing what I actually care about and what I want to be doing. So that's, if I didn't have that, then that's like why I haven't been like drinking and smoking weed and shit like that. Like I've done so much in my life as a bad coping mechanism. But this actually, like this conversation actually is really helping me, I think, with these bigger issues that I'm talking about that are going on. It's like, I think that they play a factor, but I think for me, they've been a big part of like my story about even like dealing with my mental health and shit like that over the years, that I think like you're saying and like we're talking about, it is actually more indicative of me not doing the things that I need to do in my life, or actually taking responsibility for the real reasons underlying the mental health and addiction issues. And that almost like spending all this time researching all this stuff is almost a bad coping mechanism and an addictive quality behavior to it as well, to like run away from and not take responsibility for the real issues. So I think to tie it together and to wrap this up, I think I do actually need to really stop talking about these bigger things. One, because there's only so much I can really even say about them. I'm not a fucking political scientist. I'm not this or that. And when it really comes down to it, I think that a big part of that narrative almost just needs to be a bit of a switch, that those aren't the reasons why I've struggled. They're not. Like
They're not.
I agree. And that's the thing. Like, I agree with you. I do think that they play a part. I just think that they play much less of a part than I've been leading myself to believe for literally like years, like almost the last 10 years, like since like the collapse in 2008 kind of thing. And a lot of the work I've done recently has been about taking responsibility for my thoughts and my emotions and my way I talk to myself and my behaviors, and trying to figure out what is it that I really want to be doing, what's in the way, which I've determined in a lot of ways is almost for any one of us, generally the only thing that's stopping us from achieving any goal we want is ourselves. It's our own fears, our own insecurities, our own senses of like inadequacies, our own negative self-talk and limiting beliefs. That's it. It's not an external thing it's not someone oppressing us. It's not the system.
Those things can make it more difficult, but not.
They can, and for a lot of people, for a lot of people they do, but for most of us, that's not the case.
Or at least it doesn't make it impossible. Just like
no, it doesn't make it impossible. And even in those cases, if I saw a video with, there's this guy Tom Bilyeu. He has a podcast and like a show called Impact Theory that he interviews a lot of people on, like a lot of like amazing people. Anyway, he was saying something about that too, where he's like, okay, even if because of some sort of cultural condition or systematic discrimination or oppression of some sort that makes you, as a woman or a person of color or something like that, have a more difficult time than someone like him or me as a white man in our society. Even if that's true, then okay, if it's true, if it's a real thing, then yeah, like we don't need to argue that point or say it's not there. But what are you going to do about it? Are you going to like believe that
You can't achieve anything now?
it's what's stopping you? Or are you going to do what you can and believe what you can positively about yourself, that you have a growth mindset, not a fixed mindset? Have you heard that concept before? The difference between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset? So it's by this woman, Carol Dweck. I think she has a book. It might be called like growth mindset or something like that. But it's basically like, if you have a fixed mindset, which a lot of people do in our culture, especially I think is related to people dealing with mental health issues and just negative talk and beliefs about themselves and their abilities, is that you have a fixed mindset. You think that you are how you are right now with the skills that you have, and it just is the way that it is, and you just can't do certain things, and you're just not good at certain things. It's this, there's been studies done on kids with, and that's what she talks about in her book, I'm pretty sure, like these studies with like kids who like some have this like fixed mindset that they just are how they are with the skills that they have and stuff like that, and that they're just not that good at stuff and they can't really change. And then kids that have like a growth mindset, and this is true for obviously just people in general and adults, but that when you have a growth mindset, you know that you can figure things out and you can learn and you can gain skills, and how you are now is not how you're always going to be. And it's that mindset that anyone can make that shift in mindset too. It might be hard if you have years and years of negative self-reinforcement about who you are and your abilities and stuff. You can still make that change. And yeah, so he's just talking about how, like, even if there is things in your way in your life, whether it's things that are standing in your way from some sort of systematic discrimination or oppressive type of standpoint, or whether it's the fucking shitty life you had, the emotional baggage you have, the shitty fucking things that have happened to you that made you who you are to a large extent and gave you these beliefs about yourself that are a large part of what's underlying, I think, for a lot of people struggling with their mental health and stuff. And this has been true for me because it's like I said, I've dealt with depression, anxiety, and self-worth issues my whole life. And maybe that self-worth issues and my like feelings of being unloved and unwanted by like my parents and my brother are actually what's at the heart of the negative self-talk and the limiting beliefs and the not doing the actions necessary to get out of the conditions that lead to being depressed and anxious, because you don't believe in yourself that you can actually do those things. And so that's like a lot of the work that I've been doing on myself over the last year, just like looking at what do I really want to be doing? What are my fears and insecurities that are stopping me from being able to do that? And where did they come from? And that, like what I just said, is a big part of where those fears and insecurities have come from. And then the question becomes, okay, well, it doesn't matter what happened. Who's going to change it? Is someone else going to change it for you? Is your parents going to change it for you? No. Like, I've been like really kind of picking up on and coming across a lot of people with that similar message, that it's like, take ownership over it and take responsibility for all of it, for your thoughts, your emotions, your self-talk, your beliefs, and your behaviors, and take responsibility over changing your fucking life. Because that ultimately is the actual only thing that is going to change anything. No one else is going to change your life for you. If there's systematic oppression in your life, sure, like, fight it. But also, a lot of people like me, with some of the conversation I've had about some of these larger political and social issues, me having the beliefs that they've played a more important and a larger role in my struggles with mental health and stuff like that, is a way to place blame on external forces and not take responsibility for all the shit that is happening in your own brain and with your own behavior in your own life. And yeah, like, I think that is an extremely, extremely important factor. It's like the most important factor.
I think that I like to think about as a thought experiment is like, actually, like, you know, say you end up in prison one day. And like, you have people who end up in prison, and you know, all people in prison are like, they're all limited in the same way. Some people take that opportunity as like, okay, I'm not free to go anywhere, but I'm free to learn and develop like skills. Prisons generally do have like some learning opportunities. You can sign up for courses, and they're like, you know what? This is a time where I can get free education, work on myself, work out, exercise, get in better shape, learn a fuck ton of useful things. And someone else is like in prison to form gangs and learn more ways of cheating the system once they get out. So it's like, you can be limited and oppressed, but like, you can still like choose to make the best that you can under the circumstances, while like still fighting to change the oppression. It doesn't excuse the oppression, but like, the oppression doesn't excuse you not taking the little bit of ownership that you can take. And if a person in prison can't find a way to take the little bit of ownership that they have over their life under those limited circumstances, then, you know, especially in Canada, you can still go like a really long way.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's
not to say that it's not a real thing that shouldn't be addressed, but
yeah, for sure. That's probably like, I think that was pretty good for like connecting that back to what we were talking about and then what we just talked about now. I'm just trying to think of how do we wrap this up? Any ideas?
Shouldn't that be your job?
Yes, it should. I'm still learning. I know. I was just teasing. This also, though, even just to kind of compare this to the last time we tried to record this obviously has gone, even though it's still kind of like gone on some tangents and been a bit confusing, and I'll have to have a fun time editing this.
Yeah.
No, this was a really good conversation though, because it's almost like this is one of the beautiful things about conversations and why podcasts can be so powerful, is that through having interesting conversations that make you think about things, it can totally change a belief or change the way that you think about yourself or the world, which is amazing because that can be very beneficial for your life. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will end that there. Couple of the main takeaways, obviously, that, you know, many of us do have mental health challenges. Many of us had a lot of shitty things that happened to us, and it takes a lot of hard work to rewire your brain and the way that you think, which really affects the way that you feel and the underlying beliefs that you have also really can't change unless you focus diligently on changing the way that you think. And when you do that kind of work, it will completely transform your life, or at least if you want to fix or change or transform anything in your life, then you absolutely need to undergo that type of shift within yourself, in your thinking and your feeling and your behaviors, the way that you act and the way that you show up for yourself and other people and the communities that you're a part of, and ultimately for how you show up in the world. And it's tough, but there's a lot that we can do. It can be done, and ain't nobody gonna fucking do it for you. So we gotta help each other out. And hopefully conversations like this help to do that. Until next time. Okay, so I've got the mic on the proper setting this time. So testing. We're recording right now. And what's up?
Hello.
Speak up. Project. Let's get in this. Wake up. Have some chocolate.
My diaphragm movement is slightly limited by the dinner that's sitting in my stomach.
Okay. It's so weird. It's so hard to just go without feeling weird. You know what I mean? Know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Underlying neural.
Sorry, I shouldn't be laughing about that. I'm not going to put that in. Too legit to quit. But then at
Wait, sorry. Can you can just literally repeat that. I wanted to see if the rest of the lyrics are still useful, so I literally spaced out a tiny little critical bit.
That's okay. a tiny little critical bit. I've drank and smoked weed fairly consistently throughout my life.
It can be interpreted as you were both drinking and smoking weed.
Yeah.
No, sorry.
Yeah, you haven't heard about that fucking cannabis drink?
Oh, I have heard.
I think almost just below a panic attack.
A sub-panic attack.
Yeah, a sub-panic attack. That obviously makes me feel like a stupid, lazy piece of shit pretty much, because I'm not doing what I need to do to actually be successful. I'm self-sabotaging through my procrastination. But it wasn't until this past year that I went and did a big long stint in therapy again, where I was doing it through this online app, BetterHelp. Yo, BetterHelp, you're gonna definitely be a sponsor of this fucking podcast for real though. That's one of my goals. I want to make them I want to get them as one of the sponsors on this. But yeah, I did online therapy through BetterHelp. Well, all the fucking shit that I'm stressed out about.
I was trying to tell you that because that's what will help with panic attacks in the long run, says CBT guidebook to resolving panic attacks. I was literally trying to bring it to surface because you were like, I don't know, and you're like, well, no, there's definitely a reason, and you don't need to tell me, but you need to identify it for yourself so that you can overcome it. Because once you identify the thing, then you can stop feeling non-specific panic about life.
Oh shit! I just recorded an entire intro without switching my built-in computer mic to my good mic. Motherfucker.
It's more important to get it done and get it out there than to try to make it perfect.